Hello everyone, welcome back. It's been a few weeks. This is a new chapter. So in this chapter we're going to learn about servers. Let's begin in this first video by talking about why we need server-side code in the first place. Because we've seen that you can do a lot with JavaScript in the web browser. You can connect to other servers and APIs, you can create interactive games, you can do just about anything. However, this doesn't eliminate the need for servers. So that's what we're going to cover in this video, and we're going to be using the Node environment, the Node ecosystem. So without further ado, let's jump into the action. So first, I want to spend just a minute or two to explain why we need a server in the first place. Right? So the question is, why can't we just use client-side JavaScript for everything? We've already learned how to program in the web browser. Well, here's why. So imagine this super legitimate looking bank website. It says your balance is $100. But imagine I'm a dishonest or malicious person and I just click view page source and see that there's a main JavaScript file. I could click on that and I see that there's just a variable named balance and then there's a function named render. So if I was a dishonest person, I could just open up my console in my browser and say, you know what, I think my new balance should be 9 quadrillion jillion. And then just call the render function, and there you have it. So obviously we can't actually trust client-side JavaScript because once JavaScript gets sent to the web browser, individual people can manipulate it or view it or do whatever they want with it. We cannot trust it. Or just for another quick example, here we see what color is the sky on a clear day. So if you type anything other than blue, you're going to see that is incorrect, please try again. Now obviously we know the answer is blue, and if you type that in you see that is correct. Here is some top secret data that we do not want anyone else to know. Grass is green. So imagine instead of this message, this actually was some sort of private piece of data that we didn't want anyone to see unless they knew some secret password. Right? So use your imagination and pretend this was a 12-character password instead of just the word blue that we wanted the answer to be. Now, even if you and I did not know this secret answer, if we were a malicious user, we could just view the source, view the JavaScript file, and there we can see that secret success message. Or even worse, if you go into your DevTools and click on sources, and then instead of index.html, if I click on the JavaScript file in question, you could imagine that even if the secret value was encoded or encrypted in some fashion, all you would need to do as a malicious user would be to manipulate this if statement that checks for the value. Just manipulate that so that it's always true. So I could literally just say true here, or if 2 plus 2 equals 4, hit Control S or Command S to save that, and now back in the browser, I don't even need to type in blue for this to evaluate to true. I just see that is correct, no matter what I type in. So clearly, we cannot trust client-side JavaScript. Instead, we need a trusted environment where we are in control of executing the code. Right? When we need to make actual important decisions that actually matter and have real-world consequences or security concerns, this is when we need a server or trusted environment. And that's exactly what we're going to learn how to set up and understand in this video. So right now, let's go ahead and create our first server. So I want you to follow along with me. I'm going to open up VS Code. Now, if you have not seen the earlier videos in this bootcamp series and you do not have Node.js installed on your computer, you'll want to go back in this series, or you can look for another guide on YouTube on installing Node. However, just so we can keep rolling along in this video, I'm going to assume you have Node. So I've just opened a new folder, a new empty folder. You can create it anywhere on your computer, but then go ahead and open it up in VS Code. In the command line, let's say npm init-y just to start a new project. Okay, and with Node, technically we could code our own basic web server from scratch. However, in the real world, people don't do that. In the real world, there's a super famous package called Express. Express is the industry standard for creating servers in Node. So let's just say npm install Express. Okay, let's go ahead and create a file of our own in our project folder. You could name it anything, but I'll name it main.js. Okay, let's begin by pulling in the Express package. So let's say const Express equals, and then just require it in. So the package name was Express. Next, let's actually use that. So let's create our own variable. You could name it anything. I'm going to name it app, but there's nothing special about that name. You could call it pizza or anything you like, but let's just set that to equal and then just use the Express package. Right, so we're creating a new instance of Express, and now on that variable we can begin to do things. So for example, down here we can say app dot and then call a method of listen. Let's give this two arguments. So the first is the port number that you want to run this application on. So you could say 3000 or 8080. I'll just go with 3000. If you're super new to programming, don't worry, you'll see where this number comes into play in just a moment. I will say though that if you watched the previous video about setting up a Webpack dev server, if your Webpack setup already uses port 3000, you'd want to use a different port number here, so maybe 4000. Anyways, let's move forward. So before we save this file and test it out, we do need to set up a route. So above this listen line, and the ordering here does matter, it needs to be above the listen line. Let's say what should happen if someone visits the home page of our server. So let's write out a bit of code, and then once it's up and running, we will circle back and explain it. But for now, just type this in with me. Let's say app.get, and we're going to give it two arguments. So the first is a string of text representing the route. A / means the home page, right? Just the base URL of our domain or server. We give it a second argument, and it just needs to be a function. So you could use a traditional anonymous function or an arrow function, but we need to give it two parameters. So let's say REQ and RES. These stand for request and response. We can talk more about these a bit later on in the video. For now though, let me finish out this function. So arrow symbol, curly brackets. Inside the function, let's just send back a message that says, welcome to our home page. So RES, we're using the response object. We will talk about where these come from in just a moment. But for now, inside the body of our function, let's say response.send and string of text, welcome to our home page. Now I promise we will circle back and explain this code, but before we get to that, I actually want you to select these three lines and just copy and paste and duplicate it. Only in this new copy, let's change this first argument to be /about. Right, so this would be the About Us URL or page on our website. And then we can change this message to say, thanks for learning more about us. Let's give this a save and test it out. So in our command line, we just say node and then the name of this file. So that's main. You could include the .js, but it's not necessary. And let's go ahead and run this. Now at first it might look like the task is just taking forever to finish, and that's because it sort of is. So we told Express to listen on this port, meaning it's just going to keep running until we tell it to stop, right? And that's what you would want from a server. We want it to be up and running, ongoing. So this is just going to run until we press Control-C to stop it. But we actually do want it up and running, so let's make sure it's running. And then now in your browser, we can visit localhost : and then whatever you chose for your port number. So I chose 3000. Cool. There we see. Welcome to our home page. And that's our base URL, right? But if at the end of the address we add /about, well, that's the about route that we set up. So back in our code, each one of these is a route. So a route is just us describing what should happen for a very specific type of request. So let's actually break this code down now. So we know that app is just our instance of the Express package. What is GET? Well, in the world of the internet and HTTP requests, there are different types of requests. So sort of the default type of request, when you just visit a website in your browser, that is a GET request. However, if you submit a traditional HTML form, right, you fill out a bit of info and then hit the submit button, then your browser sends a POST request. So altogether, we're just saying which type of request we're listening for. Then we're saying which part of the URL we would be listening for. right? And then the final part of the equation is just the function that we want to run in response to that request. Now, what about these two parameters? Well, Express is going to call this function for us at the appropriate time, right, when this request happens, and it's going to pass into it two arguments. So that's why we're receiving them with two parameters, request and response. You could name these anything. You could name them pizza and unicorn. We call them request and response because the first thing that Express is going to pass into our function is an object that represents the incoming request from the visitor. And then the second thing that it passes into our function is a response object where we can do all sorts of useful things, right? And that's where we're getting this useful send method to actually send a response back to the visitor. Cool, so now that we've seen a working example of a GET request, let's try a POST request. So imagine our home page sends a form that asks the user what color is the sky, and then they have to type in an answer and submit the form. So let's do that right here. We can get rid of the traditional quotes inside this response.send, and instead, if we use backticks, now we're free to drop down to multiple lines and just start writing out a bit of HTML. So for example, in between the two backticks, let's have a heading level 1 and say, what color is the sky on a clear day? Okay, and then right below that, let's have a form, right? Opening and closing form tag. Now, before we go any further, I do want to point out that I'm well aware that typing HTML into a template literal like this in the middle of our route is not ideal. So if this feels hacky or gimmicky, it should. This is just a quick proof of concept. A bit later on in the video, we will learn how to implement a real templating engine. But for now, this will definitely do the trick. Anyways, inside this form tag, let's have an input with a type of text, and let's give it a name of color. Okay, and then right below that, let's have a submit button. So opening and closing button, and just have it say submit answer. Okay, and then this is really important. On the opening form tag, we need to give it two attributes. So first, let's say action equals quotes, and then we just say where we want to point towards, which URL. You could use any value here you want, but why don't we just say /result? Okay, so that means we're going to need to set up a new route in Express for /result. You'll see where this comes into play in just a moment. However, let's also give this opening form tag another attribute of method equals quotes, and let's say uppercase post. By default, the browser will try to send a GET request when you submit a form. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. However, the browser will take whatever value the user typed into the field and add it into the resulting URL. Now, in some situations, like a search engine result screen, you might want that. You might want the value to be part of the resulting URL. However, if we use a value here of post, if we send a post request, the user's values will just live in the actual body of the request instead of in the URL. Long story short, as long as you don't need the resulting screen to have a shareable or recreatable URL, post looks a lot cleaner for the end user. Anyways, when the user visits this page and submits the form, their browser is going to send a post request to this URL. So we need to set up a new route for that type of request. So down here, we can just say app, but instead of using the GET method, let's use the POST method, right? Because we're listening or looking out for a POST request. Okay, the first value would be /result, because that's where the form is submitting to, right? /result. Okay, then we want to be sure to have a function. So parentheses, request, response, arrow symbol, curly brackets. Let's just say response.send. Thank you for submitting the form. Now, a bit later on, we can actually learn how to evaluate their answer, right? We would want to check to see, did they type in blue or not, and then say either that is correct or that is incorrect. But for now, let's just get this basic response up and running. So if we hit save and then refresh our home page, nothing will happen. This is because Express runs in memory, or I should say Node apps in general run in memory. So in order to actually see the changes take place, you do need to go into your command line, hit Control-C to stop the server, and then start it back up again so it'll use your new code. So node main, fire it up. Now if we refresh our home page, cool. So we can just fill this in. Doesn't matter what we type, just submit the answer. Cool. Thank you for submitting the form. Notice the URL is rather clean looking. If we would have used a GET request on the form instead of a POST request, the resulting URL would have looked something like this. So it would have been /result, question, color equals whatever the user typed in. Now there's nothing wrong with that. In some situations you would want a shareable or recreatable URL like that. However, oftentimes I think POST is the right tool for the job. Also, just to make this clear, if you go up into the address bar and try to manually visit this URL of /result and push enter, you'll see cannot get /result. This is because when your browser just visits a URL, remember that's a GET request. We didn't set up a route for a GET request to /result. We only set a route up if it's a POST request to this URL. Right? So for example, we could go into our code and set up app.get, a GET request route for /result, and just have a function that says response.send, why are you visiting this URL? And then if I stop the server and start it back up again, now when you manually try to visit that URL, we see why are you visiting this URL? But if we actually go to our home page and submit the form, that's a POST request, so that actually works. Or I should say it uses the route for the POST request. Cool. At this point, now that we understand the basics of routing and GET requests and POST requests, let's actually try to use the data that the visitor types in, right? So let's try to evaluate whether they type in blue or not. What color is the sky on a clear day? So if they type in the right answer, we would want to say that is correct. Or if they type anything else in, we would say, sorry, try again. So let's jump back into our code. And within our route for the POST request, inside the body of our function here, right, before we respond by sending anything back, right here we would want to be able to access the value that the user sent over. Now up until this moment, we have not used the request object that Express gives to our function. And as you might have guessed, this is where it comes into play, right? When we want to get info about the incoming request. So wouldn't it be nice if we could just say request and then look inside the body of the request and then whatever property or input value we're interested in, remember we named that input field color, wouldn't it be nice if we could access their value by just typing this? Well, we can, however, this feature is not enabled by default in Express. So before we can do this, let me actually get rid of that. I need to show you how we enable that. Up towards the very top of this file, so maybe right after these lines where we import Express and then create a new instance of it. So right here where my cursor is, let's say app, and then we want to use a method called use. This is how we can use a piece of middleware globally. Now don't worry, I don't expect you to know what middleware is just yet. I'll explain that in just a moment or two. For now though, inside these parentheses, let's type express.url encoded, parentheses to call that, give it a configuration object, so curly brackets, say extended, give it a value of false. Now this is just boilerplate standard option code, so you don't need to memorize that. You really don't need to memorize any of this line, this is boilerplate. However, this is a built-in part of Express, and what it does is it'll look at the body of the POST request, and it will add super conveniently named properties to our request.body object so that it's really easy to access the values the user submitted. Big picture, we just used our first piece of middleware, and we can learn what middleware is in just a moment. However, with this line of code in place, now back down in our POST request route, right, app.post, inside the body of our function, now we actually can just say request.body.color or whatever you named that input, and this will let us access whatever the user typed in. So inside the body of this function, let's give ourselves a clean slate. And let's just say if, parentheses, curly brackets, let's have an else block as well. For the condition, we can just say if request.body.color, if that equals blue, well, then we would say response.send, congrats, that is correct. Otherwise, in the else block, say response.send, incorrect, please try again. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. Now, if you're anything like me, it's rather annoying to have to stop your server and restart it every time you make changes. So instead, what we can do, if we say npx nodemon, right, as in node monitor, and then the name of our file, so main.js, push enter. That will take just a moment to complete. It's going to go out onto the internet, download the package called nodemon, and then use it to run our file. And what this does is now anytime we save a change to our file, it will automatically quit it and restart it for us. So we don't need to keep restarting the server. Anyways, now back in the browser, if we refresh the home page, if we type in something other than blue, hit submit, incorrect, please try again. If we go back and actually say blue, submit, congrats, that is correct. Okay, next, this has nothing to do with Express, but just to make our form a bit more robust, what if the user typed in uppercase blue or all caps blue? Or what if they started with a space and then typed blue and then entered another space? So we would still want those to be true or correct. So what we can do, in our if statement, just say if request.body.color, maybe call .trim to remove any white space at the beginning or end, and then also call to uppercase, and then we could just check against all uppercase blue, right? As long as this is true. So if we save that, nodemon will automatically restart our server for us. And if I type a space and then blue, halfway capital, halfway lowercase, I still want to give the user credit. This is correct in my opinion. Hit submit. Cool. Congrats, that is correct. Okay, now at this point, let's answer the question of what is middleware? Middleware is such a central concept of how Express works that we really can't skip over this. So a piece of middleware is really just a function that can access and modify the request and response objects. Now up towards the top, when we used app.use, whatever function we provide in the use parentheses, that's going to be used globally, or we could call it an application level middleware. However, we can also apply a piece of middleware just to individual specific routes. We would call that a router level middleware. And that's actually a much better way to really see and explain how middleware works. So let's give ourselves a quick task so that we can walk through creating a piece of middleware together. So for example, on our home page, imagine we want to show a message that says whether it's currently raining or not where the visitor lives. Now, we're not actually going to look up someone's location and fetch real weather results. We're just going to fake the actual raining or not data because that's not the point. The real point here is just that oftentimes you don't want to do everything for a route in one function. Instead, it would be nice if you could split the task up into multiple smaller bite-sized functions. This is better for organization purposes and in case we need to reuse the function elsewhere. So check this out. When we define a route in Express, instead of just giving it one function here as the second argument, we can actually give it 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 or 20 functions. And Express will just handle calling them one by one after the other. So for example, after the URL and in between this second argument of the function, so right here, I could just start typing in another function. Right, so a comma here, and then where my cursor is now, you could either spell out a traditional anonymous function or an arrow function, or to stay organized, you could create a named function. Why don't we go ahead and do that? So let's imagine we name this function getWeather. The main idea that I want to get across here is that when you're defining a route, you can list as many functions as you want. So you could have getWeather, comma, getPizza, comma, walk the dog. And then if you wanted to reuse these functions elsewhere for other routes, you absolutely could. But anyways, we just want the one get weather. Okay, now let's actually create this function. So up above, I'll say function get weather, parentheses, curly brackets. Now, just like before, when we had request and response, you always need at least those two. But there actually is a third parameter, and we typically call it next. Now, we don't need it here for this function, but when we're creating our middleware function, our getWeather function, let's say request, response, and next. So now within the body of this function, we are free to use request and response, or we could modify them. We could add on new properties to them. And then when we're actually done, we just call next. And that way Express knows that this function is done, this piece of middleware has done its job, and it's time to move on to the next function for a given route. So for example, in our function, let's just say maybe we add on a new property to the request object and call it visitor weather. And let's just set it to equal true, which means yes, it's raining. Right? This is just a quick proof of concept example, but you're free to modify the request and response objects. And then once you're done, you just call next. So altogether, when someone visits our home page, that function is going to run. Express will call it. Express will see that we called next, so then it will move on to our next function, which is just this function we already wrote. The point is that now we can access this request.visitorWeather property. So in our HTML, maybe after the form, I'll just have a paragraph, and I'll just use a ternary operator. $, curly brackets, and say if request.visitorWeather, if that's true, then let's say it is raining, colon, otherwise say it is not raining. Let's go ahead and save this, and NodeMon should restart the server for us. Back on the home page, if we refresh, cool, we see it is raining. Test this out. If we set that in our middleware function to be false, give it a save, refresh, it is not raining. So really that's all there is to middleware. It's just a function, and you can have as many functions as you want for a route, and you just need to be sure to call next so that Express can actually move on to the next function. Now you can use them for individual routes, or if you say app.use, it's going to use your function for all routes. And this is why the ordering of our lines of code matter. So when it's middleware for a specific route, obviously you can control which function or which piece of middleware runs first by just controlling the ordering that we see here. However, when you want to use a piece of middleware application-wide with app.use, that's why the ordering of your lines matter. So that's why this line of code needed to come up above any of these lines. Right, so that way, this piece of middleware that adds request.body properties of the user's form inputs, that way that actually lives on the request object by the time we need it. So just as a quick test, if we wanted to apply our getWeather function application-wide, you could just get rid of it here for this request, and then say app.use getWeather. Save that, and it still works just the same. So big picture, middleware is really simple. It's just a chance to manipulate the request and response objects, which is really all we need when you think about building a web server. Really all a web server is listening for an incoming request and then responding. Now before we move on to the next topic, I do want to make it clear that you don't need to call next. Sometimes you will want your piece of middleware to sort of intercept or end the current request. So for example, let's imagine that if it is raining, we don't want the regular website to display at all. We just want to respond back with a bit of text that says, please come back to our app when it's not raining. So in that case, we would only want to call next if it's not raining. So we could get rid of this next call here in our getWeather function and instead have an if statement and an else block and say if request.visitorWeather, if this equals true, then let's just say response.send, right? So we can end the request or respond to the request right here in this function. We don't have to pass it on with next. So we could just say, please come back to our app when it is not raining. In the else block, we actually could call next. Right? So now if we set visitor weather to true and save, we should just see, yep, please come back to our app when it is not raining. However, if we set this to false, save, now it does work, right? Because it's not raining. Now, if you use your imagination a little bit, you can imagine that you can use this middleware pattern like this to lock visitors out of certain content that they don't have permission to see, or if they're not logged in, then show them a message to please log in, right? You can intercept a request asking them to log in. If they are logged in, then you could pass them along to the next function for that route with next. The possibilities with middleware are endless, but hopefully you get the general idea. Now, before we bring this video to a close, there are a few quick topics I want to cover. So right now, let's address the fact that spelling out HTML in the middle of a function like this is not ideal. Instead, if our app needs server-generated HTML, we probably want to implement a legitimate templating engine. Now, in the world of JavaScript, there are many different template engines to choose from. I'm not going to tell you which engine you have to use. The choice is definitely yours to make. So there's a really popular one called Handlebars. So we can see it has almost 7 million weekly downloads. There's another fairly popular one called Pug. It used to go by the name of Jade. It's also fairly popular, slightly over 1 million downloads per week. Pug is fairly trendy and hip and cool. I'm not personally a very big fan of it because I don't want to have to learn an entirely separate language just to output HTML. Now that's my personal, totally subjective opinion. A lot of people absolutely love Pug. I would say when you're just starting out, if you're a beginner, don't waste your brain's horsepower trying to learn yet another language. You already know the basics of HTML, so I would just stay away from Pug until you're maybe a little bit more advanced and understand the bigger picture of JavaScript and backend and front end. But that's just my own bias shining through. Anyways, the template engine that I recommend is called EJS. You can see it has almost 7 million downloads a week. I'm not saying that EJS is the best template engine. The reason I recommend it is simply because it feels like it's the least opinionated. And there's really not a whole lot of new things you need to learn in order to start using it. It's really just JavaScript, which we're already familiar with. So let me show you how we could start using this in our Express project. We just need to go into the command line and I'll press Control-C. We want to install a package. So it's npm install EJS. Now again, after this video, if you want to try Handlebars or Pug, absolutely go for it. But in this video, we're going to use EJS. Okay, now that we've installed that, we can go ahead and tell NodeMon to start monitoring and running our app again for us. So again, that was npx NodeMon and then the name of our file. Okay. Now, up towards the top of our file, we just want to tell Express to use the EJS view engine. So first of all, actually in our overall project folder, why don't we create a subfolder named views? Technically, you could name the folder anything you want. Templates, pizza, whatever you like, but just so it makes sense, why don't we call it views? Okay, now towards the top of our Express file, as long as it's before any of our routes, we should be okay. So up here, let's just say app.set quotes view engine, comma, EJS. Okay, then let's also tell it to look inside our views folder for the actual viewer template files. So app.set, let's say views, comma, and then we're going to give it an absolute path towards our folder where all of our templates will live. To create an absolute path, let's actually use the path package that's built into the core of Node. So up at the top here, const path equals, and then just require in path. Down here for the second argument for views, it's just path.join. Call that __ dir name for the current directory, comma, and then the name of our folder is views. Okay, now let's actually just go create our first template file in our views folder. So I'm just going to click new file, You could name it anything, but we want it to end with .ejs. So why don't we just call it home.ejs. Now inside this file, you're free to write HTML. So you can just say doc, hit tab, and in the body section, I'll say welcome to the home page. Hit save. Okay, now back in our main JavaScript file, let's find the route for our home page. Here it is, right? app.get just /. And let's actually just completely empty out the body of this function. So we don't want any of this response.send. Instead of response.send, now we're going to use response.render. Right? We don't want to just send a string of text that we're defining right here. We want to render a template. So you just say the name of the template, which we named ours home, right? home.ejs. And for now, that's it. So if we hit save, back in the browser, cool, welcome to the home page. So now back in that file, we could create our form again, right? In the EJS file. So right below that, we could say form action should point towards /result. Method should be post. Inside the form, let's have an input with a type of text. Name was color. Let's have a submit button and have a little message that says, what color is the sky on a clear day? Give that a save, refresh. If we say blue, perfect. However, I do want to show you one big distinction when you're actually using a template engine. So if we go back here, the question becomes, well, what if we want to do something dynamic or access a dynamic value within our template, right? So previously, within our homepage route, we were looking at the request.visitorWeather property. Now, by default, you cannot access the entire request object inside of a template. However, it's very easy to pass any data you want into your template. So all you need to do when we say response.render, as a second argument here, you can say comma, and now you can just give it an object with different properties. So just as a quick example, you could say is raining should have a value of request.visitorWeather, comma. Just as a quick test, why don't we have another property and call it pets, comma, and set that to be an array. And inside this array, let's just have 2 pets. So the first object, let's give it a property of name, set it to meows a lot, comma, let's have another property of species, set it to cat. Inside this second object, let's say name should be barks a lot. Give it another property of species and set it to dog. Big picture, when you call response.render, the second argument can be an object with any data you want to pass into the template. So now it's going to be super easy to access is raining and pets. So if we save that, then back in our EJS file, in a way, EJS is similar to PHP. So by default, this is just HTML. But if you want to do something dynamic, you drop into EJS. So maybe below the form, let's say we want to work with that is raining property. So it's less than %. And then if you just want to simply output something, you can say $, and just the name of the property, right, is raining. And this on its own will output it. So if I refresh, we see false, right, because the request.visitorWeather was set to false. Or within EJS, if you want to run a little bit of logic or just regular JavaScript code, you don't need the equal sign to output, so it's just less than %. Now inside here, we could just have a regular JavaScript if statement. So we could say if, parentheses, curly brackets, even have an else block, and just say if is raining. Okay, then in here you could do something with JavaScript, or if you just want to output HTML, then right here you could just exit out of EJS. And then on this line, you could enter back into EJS. You get the idea right here. You would exit it. Right here, you would enter it. So here you could say, if it is raining, have a paragraph, it is raining. Else, say, it is not raining. Give it a save, refresh, perfect. And really quick, let me show you how we could loop through our array of pets. So below all of this, Let's start working with our pets array. So just less than %, and then close it out. Inside there, we would want to start working with our pets array. So pets. In JavaScript, arrays have access to a method of for each. So I just say pets.forEach. Inside here, let's give it a function. Let's just use an arrow function. So we only have one parameter. We don't even need parentheses. We could call it x, but why don't we just call it pet, as in singular, the current pet that's been looped to. And then we want the arrow symbol, and then curly brackets. Let's drop down. Now, right after the start of the body of our function, why don't we drop out of EJS, because we really just want to output a little bit of HTML for each item in the array. And then down here, right before the ending or closing of the body of our function, let's just jump back into EJS. Okay, so right here, we're free to output HTML. Let's say list item maybe, and let's just have the pet name, and then in parentheses, their species, right? So it would be name, parentheses, species. So instead of name here, hard-coded, we could just say EJS. And to actually output something, instead of just running JavaScript, and it will automatically escape it for us, we can just say equal sign. So that would be pet.name, close out of EJS. And then inside the parentheses, so the parentheses have nothing to do with EJS. I actually want to output those in the HTML visually. But then we would just say EJS equals pet.species, drop back out of EJS. Let's give this a save and test it out. Back in the browser, if I refresh, cool, we successfully looped through that array. Now I realize that was probably difficult to follow along with all the dropping into and out of EJS. Please rest assured that you can find a link in the description of this video with a GitHub repo where you can find this finished code. Okay, now there are just two more quick things I want to cover before we bring this video to a close. So we're in an HTML template right now. What if we wanted to link to a CSS file, right? So up in our head section, you would imagine we'd want to say link, hit tab, and just maybe point towards a file called style.css. The question is, though, in terms of our folder structure, where would we place a style sheet so that the visitors of our website actually have access to it? Because the whole point of a server is that the visitors can't access our source code, right? The visitors of our website, they're never going to see this actual EJS template file with our source code here. And they're definitely never, ever, ever going to see the actual contents of our main.js file. The whole point of a server is that visitors only see the actual content that you send back in your response. So we do want to specify a special folder to be our public folder. And then that's where we can place things like a CSS file or a JavaScript file that we do want the whole world to be able to easily access. So in the root of our project, let's create a folder. You could name it anything, but why don't we name it public? And then towards the top of our main.js file, let's just use a piece of app-wide middleware. So just say app.use. And then inside here, we're going to call a built-in part of Express. So express.static. And we just want to serve up a static folder, right? Our public folder. So path.join __ dir name, comma, public. Okay, now inside of public, we could create a CSS or JavaScript file and then link to it in our HTML, right? Just like you've already learned how to do throughout this bootcamp series. So just for a quick test, if I say new file, style.css, and then if I say body, color, purple, give it a save, back in our EJS or HTML, we're already pointing towards that. And actually, to make this work with all routes and all URL patterns, you would want to include a slash here. So that way, even if you're in a nested URL, it knows to look at the root of your server or domain for style.css. So if we save this and refresh, everything is purple. And you could obviously do this exact same thing down right before the closing body tag to load in a JavaScript, a front-end client-side JavaScript file. Okay, and changing gears, the very last thing I want to show you in this video is how to send JSON instead of HTML as your server's response. right? So for example, you could imagine that on our website, someone maybe would want to visit /API/pets, and they would want to get just raw JSON data about our different pets. So how would we serve up JSON instead of HTML? Well, let's go do this right now. Let's go set up a route for a GET request to /API/pets. So in our main.js file, maybe down towards the bottom, let's just create a new route, say app.get /API/pets, give it a function, so request.response, arrow symbol. And now instead of response.send or response.render, there's actually a method in Express called response.json. That's it. You just give it an object or a bit of JSON, and it will convert it into plain text for you. And in order to save a bit of typing, I'm just going to scroll up, and I'm just going to grab this array with the 2 pets in it. So from the starting square bracket to the closing square bracket, copy that down here. In response.json, just paste that in, hit save. And now if you visit that URL, cool. Now talking about JSON briefly at the end here segues perfectly into what we're going to cover in the next video. Having said that, that does bring the technical aspect of this video to a close. Congrats on making it to the end of this video. The question now is, where do we go from here? So in our next video, I want to talk about how we can connect the back end with the front end. So towards the end of this video, we saw that you can send back JSON as the server's response. And as we've already learned earlier in this bootcamp series, it's very easy to fetch raw JSON data on the fly with client or front-end JavaScript. So in our very next video, we're going to set up a very basic, super simple API. This will allow us to do a few things. So we'll see how our server's data is available from anyone, right? You could access it from a native iOS or Android app, and we'll also see how to leverage that data from perhaps a React front end. I think seeing how all of these things connect and work together could be an aha moment. Anyways, as always, if you're enjoying this series so far, I'd appreciate it if you could share the link with your friends and family. Take care. I'll see you in the next one.